You already know how this story starts. The taxes, the tea in Boston Harbor, no taxation without representation, redcoats marching in formation while farmers fired at them from behind stone walls. And sure, all of that is part of it. Those things happened. The anger was real. But here's a number that should stop you. By most estimates, a colonist in 1765 paid less than 1/20th of the tax burden carried by a man living in England. Same king, same parliament, same empire. The people paying the least rose up. The people paying the most stayed home and grumbled about it in the pub. So the real question was never why Americans were angry about taxes. The question is why a tax that small could break an empire that large. The answer is not in the tax. It is in what the colonists were being asked to pay. The American Revolution did not begin in Boston Harbor. It began in an office in London. 11 years before the tea went into the water, with an act of parliament that almost no American today can name. So I am not going to walk you through Lexington and Concord. There are 1,000 videos about this shooting. I'm going to walk you through the ledgers, the debt books, and the private accounts of a company that was quietly going broke. And at the end of this, we are going to stand together in a room in Whitehall on a cold January morning in 1774 and watch the most loyal Englishman in America get torn apart for a solid hour while the nobility laughed. He walked into that room believing in the empire. He walked out a traitor. Start with something that probably was not in your textbook. The colonies were not poor. By the middle of the 18th century, a free colonist in British America likely enjoyed one of the highest standards of living in the entire Western world. Better diet, more land, higher literacy in New England than in most of Europe. Historians still argue about the exact numbers, but nobody serious argues about the direction. This was not a struggling frontier begging for relief. This was a boom. And that is what makes the next fact so strange. The colonies were rich in almost everything except money. Not wealth, money, the physical stuff, coins. Because here is the problem nobody had a solution for. North America had no significant silver mines and no gold mines. Every hard coin in circulation had to arrive from somewhere else, usually through trade with the Caribbean or with Spanish merchants. And almost as fast as it arrived, it left again, shipped back across the Atlantic to pay London merchants for manufactured goods, cloth, tools, nails, glass, anything made in a factory. Picture a bathtub with the drain permanently open. That was the colonial money supply. Water going in, water going straight back out, and the level never rising. So they invented a solution. In 1690, the colony of Massachusetts needed to pay soldiers coming home from a failed expedition against Quebec. The treasury was empty. The men were armed and furious, and rather than default, the government printed paper notes and promised to accept them back later as payment for taxes. It worked. That is, as far as we know, the first government-issued paper currency in the Western world, not in London, not in Paris, in Boston, out of desperation, decades before any European state tried it. And over the next 60 years, the colonies built something that Europe simply did not have. Pennsylvania went furthest. In 1723, the colony set up what was essentially a public land bank. A farmer could borrow paper money from the government using his land as collateral. He paid interest on the loan, and that interest revenue funded the colonial government so effectively that for long stretches, Pennsylvania collected almost no direct taxes from its own people at all. Read that again. A government that funded itself by lending money into existence, rather than by taxing it out of people. Was it perfect? No. Rhode Island printed recklessly, and its currency depreciated badly, which gave the whole system a bad reputation that its critics never let go of. But where it was managed carefully, in Pennsylvania, in New York, in New Jersey, it did something remarkable. It gave a cash-starved economy a bloodstream. And one young printer noticed. In 1729, a 23-year-old tradesman in Philadelphia published an anonymous pamphlet defending paper currency. He argued that a shortage of money strangled trade, drove up interest rates, and pushed young men to leave the colony. He argued that more currency meant more building, more hiring, more commerce. The pamphlet worked, the assembly authorized a new issue, and the young printer, Benjamin Franklin, won the contract to print it. Remember him? He is going to spend the next 45 years of his life trying to save the British Empire from itself, and we are going to watch exactly what the empire does to him for it. Now, a word before we go further, because this video is going to challenge a story that a lot of people hold close. I am not here to tell you the founders did not believe in liberty. They did. The ideas in the Declaration were not a marketing campaign. Men risked hanging for them, and some of them meant every word. But ideas do not decide when a crisis arrives. Conditions do. Liberty had been argued about in coffee houses for 100 years without a single shot being fired. Something changed between 1763 and 1775 that turned an argument into a war. That something was financial, and this video is about the part that gets left out. Because here is what the colonists had accomplished by 1750. They had, quietly and without permission, developed their own monetary system. They had solved the drain in the bathtub. The trouble was that in London there were men who read balance sheets for a living, and they did not like what they were looking at. In February of 1763, Britain won not a small victory. The Treaty of Paris ended the 7 Years' War and handed the British Empire the largest territorial gain in its history. Canada, Florida, dominance in India, French power in North America erased from the map. Bonfires burned in London, church bells rang, men wrote poems about it. British America celebrated too, for that moment. The proudest subjects in the empire. They had fought alongside British regulars. They had won. And that summer, the men who counted the money opened the books. The national debt had roughly doubled during the war, climbing from around £75 million to something close to £133 million. In today's terms, you would be talking about hundreds of billions. But the raw number is not the part that mattered. What mattered was the interest. Servicing that debt was consuming somewhere in the neighborhood of £4.5 million a year against total government revenue of roughly £8 million, which means that more than half of everything the British government collected went straight out the door to bondholders before a single soldier was paid, a single ship was repaired, or a single road was built. Stop and sit with that for a second, because it is the hinge the entire story turns on. Britain had just conquered half a continent and could not afford to hold it, and there was no easy money left at home. The land tax had been pushed up to 4 shillings in the pound during the war, roughly 20%. And the country gentlemen who paid it were the same men who filled the benches of Parliament. They wanted it down, then. In 1763, the government tried a modest new tax on cider, and parts of the west of England came close to open revolt over it. Crowds burned effigies. The ministry that passed it fell within weeks. So the lesson landed hard in Westminster. Tax the English, and you lose your job. Which brings us to the sentence that most histories of the Revolution never quite say out loud. Britain's problem was never America. Britain's problem was debt service. And America happened to be the one asset on the balance sheet that had not yet been squeezed. The empire did not suddenly develop a philosophical conviction that colonies must be governed more tightly. It developed a cash flow crisis, and then went looking for a payer who could not vote. Now, at almost exactly the same moment, a second complaint was landing on desks in Whitehall. A quieter one, the kind that never makes it into a documentary. London merchants were angry about how they were getting paid. For years, they had extended credit to tobacco planters in Virginia and Maryland. Ship the goods now, settle the account later. And lately, they said, planters had been settling those accounts in colonial paper money that had lost value since the debt was contracted. In 1755 and again in 1758, Virginia had issued paper to fund the war effort. To the planters, this was legitimate currency, backed by future taxes. To a merchant in London holding an invoice denominated in sterling, it looked like being paid back in something worth less than what he had lent. He wanted the government to do something about it. It was not a conspiracy. It was not even really a political demand. It was an administrative grievance from a group of businessmen who felt shortchanged. The sort of letter that arrives in a ministry every day of the week and is filed and forgotten. This one was not forgotten. It reached the desk of a man who had just taken over as First Lord of the Treasury. A man who read complaints like that carefully. Because he read everything carefully. Over the following 24 months, he would do 3 things. Every one of them was legal, every one of them was defensible, and together they would take the most prosperous set of colonies on earth and pull the floor out from under them. His name was George Grenville. He was not a tyrant. That is the first thing to understand about him. And the most uncomfortable, Grenville was a lawyer by training, a career administrator by temperament, and by all accounts one of the most tedious men in 18th century politics. Colleagues complained that he could speak for 2 hours about customs revenue without noticing that the room had emptied. King George III eventually came to loathe being in the same room with him, and later said that Grenville had a way of explaining things to him as though he were a child who had never seen an account book. He believed in one simple principle. The nation's finances should be run the way a careful man runs a household. You do not spend what you do not have. Everyone pays their share. Nobody gets an exemption because they are far away. There is not a single surviving line in which he expresses hatred for America. He did not think about America very much at all. He thought about the deficit. And that is what makes what happened next so much worse than a villain would have been. Nobody in this story wakes up and decides to strangle a continent. They just do the responsible thing over and over until the continent stops breathing. He moved first in April of 1764. The first move, the American Revenue Act, which everyone calls the Sugar Act. And here is the detail that gets left out of almost every telling, because it sounds like it belongs in the wrong story. The Sugar Act cut the tax on foreign molasses. It took the duty from 6 pence per gallon down to 3. The rate went down. The problem was that the old 6 pence had been a fiction. Nobody paid it. Colonial merchants had been importing molasses from the French Caribbean for decades and settling the matter with customs officers for a fraction of the legal rate, and everyone involved, including Parliament, understood that this was how it worked. The tax existed on paper. The trade existed in reality. Both sides left each other alone. Grenville ended that. The new act came with enforcement, naval patrols, paperwork requirements so detailed that a captain could lose his cargo over a clerical error. Customs officials rewarded with a share of what they seized, and critically, accused smugglers would now be tried in vice admiralty courts, where a judge decided the case alone. No jury. That was the part that lit the fuse in Boston, and it had nothing to do with the number 3. An Englishman's right to be judged by a jury of his neighbors was not a tax policy detail. It was, in the colonial mind, the difference between a subject and a subordinate. So write down the lesson, because the entire revolution runs on it. It was never the rate, it was who held the machinery. The second move, then, a few weeks later, in the same spring session, Parliament passed something that got almost no attention at all, the Currency Act of 1764. It is the most important law in this video, and I would guess that fewer than 1 American in 100 could tell you what it did. An earlier act, in 1751, had already restricted paper money in New England. This one extended the restriction across all 13 colonies. And the crucial provision is narrower than the internet usually claims. So let me be precise about it, because the truth is damning enough without exaggeration. Parliament did not ban colonial assemblies from printing paper. Parliament banned colonial paper from being legal tender, meaning a court could no longer be compelled to accept it as valid payment for a debt. That sounds technical? Follow what it actually does. If a currency cannot legally settle a debt, then no rational creditor will take it at face value. Its acceptance depends entirely on the goodwill of the man you owe. So it starts trading at a discount, then a deeper discount. Then the assemblies, knowing they can no longer issue reliable money, stop issuing much at all. Because what is the point of printing something the courts will not honor? The bathtub drain is still open, and Parliament has just turned off the tap. Here is what that felt like on the ground. Imagine waking up tomorrow and learning that a government 5,000 miles away, which you did not elect, has decided that the dollars in your wallet can no longer be used to settle a debt. Your mortgage still exists. Your car loan still exists. The amount you owe has not changed by 1 cent. But the thing you were going to pay it with has just been declared unacceptable, and you are forbidden from making more. That is not a tax. A tax takes a slice of your income. This reached into the plumbing of the entire economy and closed a valve. The effects arrived exactly the way an economist would predict, and exactly the way Grenville apparently never considered. the money supply contracted. Prices for colonial produce fell, which meant a farmer needed more bushels of wheat to pay the same fixed debt he had signed for 3 years earlier. In real terms, every existing loan in America quietly got heavier. Court dockets filled with debt actions. Sheriff sales of land increased. Merchants who had been solvent in 1763 were illiquid by 1766, not because they had lost customers, but because nothing could be settled. And in some regions, people did what humans always do when the money stops working. They went backward. Accounts were settled in tobacco, in deerskins, in barrels of pork, in nails, in bushels of corn. There are surviving colonial records of clergymen being paid their salary in tobacco leaf. This was happening inside one of the most commercially dynamic economies on the face of the earth. In the same decade that Philadelphia was becoming the second largest city in the British Empire. Now, in fairness, and I want to be fair here, historians still argue about how severe the contraction was and how much of the mid-1760s slump was simply the ordinary post-war depression that follows every major war, when military spending stops. Both things were happening at once. The Currency Act did not create the downturn by itself. What it did was remove the only tool the colonies had ever used to survive one. And there is a second consequence, subtler and more corrosive, that mattered more than the economics. For 70 years, colonial assemblies had controlled their own money. That was the one power that made them feel like governments rather than committees. Parliament had just reached across an ocean and taken it, in a bill so unremarkable that it passed with almost no debate. Nobody in London thought they had done anything dramatic. They thought they had fixed a merchant's complaint. So take stock of where America stands in the winter of 1764. Cash is draining out, paper is dying, debts are getting heavier every month, enforcement ships are in the harbor, and juries have been taken off the table, and George Grenville, having just drained the colonies of their money supply, was now going to send them a bill, payable in silver, March of 1765. The Stamp Act, you know the outline of this one. A tax on paper. Every legal document, every newspaper, every pamphlet, every ship's clearance, every liquor license, every deck of playing cards, every college diploma had to be printed on stamped paper carrying a duty. That is the part that survived into the textbooks. Here is the part that did not, and it is the whole reason the colonies detonated. The act required that the duties be paid in sterling, hard coin, British money. The exact thing the Currency Act had just made it impossible for them to create a substitute for. One law took away their ability to make money. The next law demanded payment in the only money they had left, the coin that was already draining out of the continent faster than it came in. You cannot tax a colony in silver and forbid it to make anything else. That is not rhetoric. That is arithmetic. Parliament had built a trap with two jaws, closed them in the space of 11 months, and as far as the surviving record shows, never once noticed that the two acts were connected. Now look at what the trap was supposed to catch. The Stamp Act was projected to raise somewhere around £60,000 a year against a national debt of $133 million and annual interest charges in the millions. £60,000 was a rounding error. It would not have covered 2 weeks of debt service. Grenville himself framed it as a matter of principle as much as revenue, a first step toward the colonies contributing something toward their own defense. Think about that for a moment, because it explains everything that follows. The reaction was wildly out of proportion to the money, which tells you the money was never the point. On either side, for Grenville, it was about establishing the principle that Parliament could tax America directly. For the colonists, it was about the same principle. Viewed from the other end of the barrel, both sides understood immediately that £60,000 was not the prize. Precedent was the prize. And then Grenville made the single dumbest tactical error in the story. Look again at what the Stamp Act taxed: legal documents, that is lawyers, newspapers and pamphlets, that is printers, ships' papers and commercial instruments, that is merchants, college diplomas, that is the clergy and the educated class. Of every group in colonial society he could have reached for, Grenville had managed to select with almost surgical accuracy the four professions that manufactured public opinion: the men who wrote the arguments, the men who owned the presses that printed the arguments, the men who financed the presses, and the men who read the results aloud on Sunday. An empire that wants a quiet tax does not put it on the printing press. The response came faster than the news of it could cross the Atlantic in the other direction. The Virginia Resolves in May, the Stamp Act Congress in October, 9 colonies sending delegates to sit in the same room, which had never happened before over anything, non-importation agreements that cut orders to British merchants by hundreds of thousands of pounds and turned London's own business class into America's lobbyists. And in Boston, it went beyond paper. On the night of August 26, 1765, a crowd came for Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Hutchinson was American-born, Massachusetts-born, from a family that had been in the colony for over a century. He had privately opposed the Stamp Act. He had written to friends in England warning that it was unwise. None of that saved him. The crowd had decided he was Parliament's man in Boston, and being right in private has never once protected anybody from a mob. They took the house apart over several hours, not looted, dismantled. They stripped the interior walls, tore the wainscoting out, split the doors, drank the wine cellar dry, and worked at the roof with axes until only the frame was standing. And they threw his papers into the street. Hutchinson had spent years writing a history of Massachusetts, working from original documents he had collected, many of which existed nowhere else. The manuscript and the records went out the windows into the mud, and it rained. A neighbor spent the following morning walking the street, picking sodden pages out of the gutter and returning what he could. Hutchinson appeared in court the next day in the only clothes he had left, having watched a lifetime of work destroyed by his own neighbors. Hold on to that name, Thomas Hutchinson, because 8 years from now, in a room in London, a bundle of this man's private letters is going to end the career of the most famous American alive. Parliament, meanwhile, did what governments do when the ground shifts under them. It called witnesses. And the man who walked into the House of Commons to explain America to the Empire was not a radical, not a firebrand, and not a rebel. He was the single most committed believer in the British Empire that America ever produced. February 13, 1766, the House of Commons, sitting as a committee of the whole. Benjamin Franklin was 60 years old. He had been in London for most of the past decade as an agent for the Pennsylvania Assembly. And by this point, he was probably the most celebrated colonial in Europe, the man who had pulled lightning out of the sky, a fellow of the Royal Society, honorary degrees from St. Andrews and Oxford. When he walked into a room in London, he was not a provincial. He was a scientific celebrity who happened to come from Philadelphia. He stood before Parliament and answered questions for hours. Roughly 174 of them survive in the printed record. And what he told them was not a threat, it was a diagnosis. He explained the mechanism where, he asked in effect, do you imagine the silver is going to come from? The colonies produce no precious metal. What hard coin they obtain from trade flows straight back to Britain to pay for British manufactured goods. You have now forbidden colonial paper from settling debts, and you are demanding a new tax payable in specie. There is no fund to draw on. The money does not exist. Then he made the argument he thought would land, because it was the one aimed at his listeners' own interests. Break the colonial economy and you break your best customer. American purchases of British manufacturers had grown enormously over the preceding decades. Squeeze the colonies hard enough and Americans would not simply pay less, they would start making their own cloth, their own nails, their own everything. And once those habits set, they would not go back. Asked what the temper of America had been before 1763, he described it as the best in the world. Asked what it was now, he said it had been very much altered. Read the transcript today, and the thing that jumps out is what Franklin was not asking for. He was not asking for independence. The idea would have appalled him. In 1766, he thought of himself as a British subject who happened to live in the western half of the empire. And he had spent years floating the notion that America and Britain might grow together into a single greater nation, with Americans eventually sitting in Parliament. What he was asking for was permission to make money again. That was it. Restore the currency, let the assemblies issue legal tender under reasonable limits, let the colonies breathe. And they will remain the empire's most loyal and most profitable possession. He was asking for the right to stay. And on March 18, 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. It looked like a total victory. Bells rang in Boston. Merchants in London who had lost orders celebrated. A statue of the king was commissioned in New York out of gratitude. Franklin's reputation in America, which had been shaky because he had initially misjudged the crisis and even recommended a friend for a stamp distributor post, was rebuilt overnight. Now here's the part that almost never gets told in the same breath. On the same day Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it passed something else. The Declaratory Act, it stated that Parliament held full power and authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In all cases whatsoever. That phrase was not decoration. It was lifted from the language Parliament had used to assert supremacy over Ireland. And every lawyer in the room knew it. So Parliament gave up £60,000 and kept the principle. It surrendered the bill and retained the claim. And the Currency Act, untouched. Nobody repealed it. Nobody debated it. Nobody in the celebrations on either side of the ocean seems to have mentioned it at all. The tax was gone. And the tax had been the visible thing. So everyone declared the crisis over and went home. The tourniquet stayed on the arm. Parliament had removed the invoice and kept the chokehold. And it did so without any sense that it was doing anything clever, because it never understood that the chokehold existed in the first place. I want to be careful here, because this is the point where a video like this one usually turns into something dishonest. There was no cabal. Nobody in Westminster was sitting in a back room designing the slow financial suffocation of North America. Most members of Parliament had never met an American, had no clear picture of colonial conditions, and did not consider the question important enough to study. The Currency Act was not malice. It was indifference wearing the costume of good administration. Which, if you are on the receiving end, is not meaningfully different. Franklin went back to his lodgings on Craven Street, where he rented rooms from a widow named Margaret Stevenson. And he believed the worst was behind him. He would stay in London another 8 years. 8 years of dinners, experiments, negotiations, and patient letters home telling his countrymen to be calm, that reasonable men would settle this. And during those 8 years, the thing that would finally break the empire was going to come from a direction he was not watching at all. Not from Parliament, from a bank. What follows is the stretch of the story that documentaries usually skip, because on the surface, almost nothing happens. In 1767, Charles Townshend, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, tried a smarter version of the same idea. Instead of an internal tax, he put duties on goods coming into colonial ports: glass, lead, paint, paper, tea. He believed Americans had objected only to internal taxation and would accept external duties on trade. They did not. Non-importation started again. Merchants in Philadelphia and New York cut British orders. British exporters lost money and complained to their own government exactly as they had in 1765. By 1770, most of the Townshend duties were repealed. Except one, the duty on tea stayed not because it raised much, but because the ministry wanted one surviving tax to prove the principle from the Declaratory Act was still alive. They kept the smallest possible tax for the largest possible reason. Remember that. Because in 3 years it is going to matter enormously. Then, on the night of March 5th, 1770, a crowd surrounded a British sentry outside the Custom House in Boston, threw snowballs, and worse, soldiers fired, and 5 colonists died. Boston buried them as martyrs. And then, remarkably, things calmed down. The soldiers were tried and defended in court by John Adams, and most were acquitted. Trade resumed, orders from Britain climbed to new records, committees of correspondence went quiet. By 1772, a British official could reasonably write home that the American troubles were over, that the agitators had lost their audience, and that the colonies had returned to their natural state of prosperous loyalty. Notice the rhythm, though it is the most important thing in this chapter. The 1766 repeal bought roughly 1 year of quiet before Townshend reopened everything. The 1770 repeal bought roughly 3 years. The next concession is going to buy nothing at all. Each settlement purchases less peace than the one before it, because each one leaves the underlying pressure in place and treats only the symptom that happened to be visible that year. That is not politics. That is what a system looks like on the way to failure. And underneath the calm, the pressure was building in a place nobody was looking. Debt, not government debt, private debt. The ordinary commercial credit that held the Atlantic economy together. The tobacco planters of Virginia and Maryland ran their entire lives on it. A planter shipped his crop to a merchant house in London or Glasgow, and against the expected proceeds, he ordered everything his household needed for the coming year. furniture, wine, tools, cloth, books, a new carriage. If the crop came in strong, the account balanced. If it came in weak, the difference rolled forward into next year, with interest. Roll that forward for a generation, and the arithmetic becomes brutal. Estimates put total colonial debt to British merchants somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 million pounds by the early 1770s, with the largest concentration in the tobacco colonies. George Washington was in it. He spent years trying to work free of his London merchant house and eventually shifted away from tobacco toward wheat, partly to escape the trap. Thomas Jefferson was in it, deeply, and never got out. He later wrote that the planters of Virginia had become a species of property annexed to certain mercantile houses in London. Sit with that sentence for a second. This is a man who would write that all men are created equal, describing his own class as property attached to a creditor. And this whole arrangement, the credit, the rolling balances, the year-ahead ordering, worked on one condition and one condition only. The credit had to keep flowing. In June of 1772, it stopped. On June 8, 1772, a London banker named Alexander Fordyce did not show up for work. Fordyce was a partner in the banking house of Neil, James, Fordyce and Down, on Threadneedle Street. He had built a reputation as a man with a gift for the markets, kept a lavish house, ran for Parliament, and was known around the city as someone who understood which way things were moving. What almost nobody knew was that he had been short-selling East India Company stock with his firm's money, betting the price would fall. It rose instead. He covered the losses by taking more from the partnership's deposits and doubling down, which is what men in that position have always done and always will. By early June, the whole was somewhere around £300,000. He fled to France. The bank suspended payments on June 10, and then the thing happened that the 18th century had never really seen before. Within days, depositors were queuing outside other banks. Not because those banks were insolvent, but because nobody could tell which ones were. The credit system of the day ran on a dense web of bills of exchange, one house accepting another house's paper, everybody holding claims on everybody else, and no way for an outsider to see who was exposed to whom. By the end of the month, roughly 20 banking houses in London had failed or suspended. In Scotland, the Ayr Bank, formerly Douglas, Heron and Company, went down, and it took a large slice of the Scottish gentry with it, because the bank's partners carried unlimited liability, and many of them had to sell their estates to cover the losses. Adam Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations at the time and watched the whole thing at close range. The Ayr Bank collapse appears in the finished book as a case study in how easily credit can be conjured and how violently it disappears. Historians now call it the credit crisis of 1772, and it is one of the first genuinely transatlantic financial panics in modern history, because it did not stay in London. Here is how it traveled, and I want to go slowly, because this is the mechanism the rest of the video depends on. The Scottish merchant houses in Glasgow were the dominant force in the Virginia and Maryland tobacco trade. When their credit lines in Britain froze, they had exactly one place to go for cash. They called in the American accounts. Not gradually, all at once. And all of them at the same time. Because every house was under the same pressure in the same month. So a planter in Virginia who had been carrying a rolling balance for a decade, an arrangement everyone treated as normal, suddenly received a demand for full settlement. And he could not pay, not because he was poor. He owned land, he owned a crop in the ground, he owned, in the ugliest arithmetic of that world, enslaved human beings who were counted on his ledger as assets. On paper, he was wealthy. He simply had no money. There was no hard coin in the colony to speak of. Colonial paper could not legally settle a debt, because Parliament had seen to that 8 years earlier and never revisited it. And he could not sell land to raise cash, because every other planter in the colony had received the same letter in the same month, and they were all trying to sell into a market with no buyers. Tobacco prices fell, land values fell. Court dockets in Virginia filled with debt suits so fast that in 1774 the colony's courts effectively shut down rather than process them all. If that pattern sounds familiar, it should. This is a margin call. A lender's own funding dries up, so the lender demands immediate repayment from borrowers, who must sell assets to comply, which pushes asset prices down, which triggers more demands. It is the same machine that ran in 1929 and the same machine that ran in 2008 operating in 1772 with sailing ships instead of terminals, and taking 7 weeks to cross the Atlantic instead of 7 milliseconds. The colonies did not experience this as a technical event in the London money market. They experienced it as their neighbors losing their farms. But the largest casualty of the crash was not in Virginia. It was the company Fordyce had been betting against in the first place. The English East India Company was not a business in any sense we would recognize. It was a joint stock corporation with shareholders and a board, and it also ruled Bengal after the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the grant of the Diwani in 1765. The company had acquired the right to collect land revenue from a population in the tens of millions. It maintained an army that by this point numbered in the tens of thousands, larger than the standing army of most European states. A private company listed on the London Exchange with its own soldiers and its own tax base, and it was going broke. The reasons stacked on each other. Revenue from Bengal had been wildly overestimated, and a catastrophic famine in 1770, worsened by the company's own revenue demands, killed a huge share of the population there and destroyed the tax base along with them. Military costs kept climbing. The company had continued paying generous dividends to shareholders out of borrowed money to keep the stock price up, which is precisely the behavior that had drawn Fordyce into shorting it. Then the credit market froze in June 1772, and the company could no longer roll over its short-term borrowing. By the summer of 1772, it was carrying enormous debts, including money owed directly to the Bank of England and to the Treasury. And it was sitting on warehouses in London stacked with something on the order of 17 million pounds of unsold tea, an asset it could not turn into cash. In the autumn, it went to the government and asked for a loan of £1.5 million. Now, Parliament could have let it fail. Consider what failing would have meant. Company stock was one of the most widely held securities in Britain, embedded in the portfolios of banks, insurers, charitable trusts, and a considerable number of members of Parliament themselves. Its debts ran through the Bank of England. Its collapse would have taken down more houses in a market that had just watched 20 of them go under in a single month. And there was the other problem. If the company died, who governed Bengal? So Parliament did the arithmetic that every government does at this moment in every century, and reached the conclusion it always reaches. The East India Company was the first corporation in history that was too big to fail. Parliament worked that out in 1773, and Washington would work out the same thing 235 years later. The rescue came in two pieces. The Regulating Act brought the company under government supervision, the first real step toward the state taking over India, and the loan was approved. But a loan alone does not fix a warehouse full of tea that nobody is buying. The company did not need charity. It needed a market. It needed somewhere it could dump 17 million pounds of leaf quickly at a price low enough to move it. Parliament found one. They were not going to pay for this bailout with British tax money. They were going to pay for it with America, May 10, 1773. The Tea Act. Take it apart piece by piece, because every clause in it is doing work. Before this act, the system ran like this. East India Tea arrived in London, was sold at public auction to British wholesalers, and those wholesalers then sold it onward, including to American merchants who shipped it across and sold it in the colonies. Every step took a margin. The Tea Act let the company skip the auction entirely and ship directly to America. It also let the company recover duties it had already paid in Britain. Add those together, and the result is the single most inconvenient fact in the founding story of the United States. Tea got cheaper. Legally landed East India tea, with the Townshend duty of 3 pence still on it, was now going to arrive in Boston and New York, priced to undercut the smuggled Dutch tea that a large part of the colonial market had been drinking for years. So understand what this actually was. This was not a tax increase. It was a price cut, engineered by Parliament to move a bankrupt corporation's dead inventory. They did not dump the tea because it was too expensive. They dumped it because it was too cheap. Now the second clause, which is the one that turned an economic grievance into a personal one, the company was not permitted to sell to whoever wanted to buy. It would sell through a fixed list of appointed consignees in each colonial port, a closed roster of licensed agents chosen in London. In Boston, the list included Richard Clark and his sons, and 2 young men named Thomas and Elisha Hutchinson. The sons of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, the same Hutchinson whose house had been torn apart in 1765. There was also a nephew in the arrangement. So the picture from Boston looked like this. A politically connected corporation gets rescued by the state, is handed a legal monopoly on a market it did not previously dominate, and the exclusive right to profit from that monopoly locally is awarded to the governor's own family. Every single element of that sentence was legal. And here's who it actually hurt. Not the tea drinker. He was about to pay less. It hurt the American merchant class, the importers, the wholesalers, the shippers. And yes, the smugglers, the men who had built the colonial tea trade, and who had just spent a year and a half getting flattened by the credit crash of 1772. These were people already scrambling for cash in a market with no currency. And Parliament had now handed their entire product line to a competitor that could not lose. That is the coalition that acted, not a mob of philosophers. Merchants defending a business, standing alongside men who had spent years reading Locke, and both groups had reason to be there. Which brings me to the part that a lot of retellings sand down. John Hancock, the wealthiest merchant in Boston and one of the loudest voices against the tea, had made a substantial part of his fortune in trade that included evading customs. He was not a neutral party. He had a stake. That does not make him a fraud. Men can defend their livelihood and their principles at the same time. And most people who have ever fought for anything have done exactly that. But if you want the adult version of this story rather than the pageant version, you have to hold both facts at once. The Sons of Liberty were not angels descending on Boston Harbor. They were a political movement with a commercial wing, and the commercial wing had bills to pay. 3 ships carrying the tea reached Boston in late November and early December of 1773. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, under the law, once a ship had been in port 20 days. Customs could seize the cargo for non-payment of duty and land it. For the Dartmouth, that deadline fell on December 17. The town wanted the ships to sail back to England with the tea aboard. Governor Hutchinson refused to grant clearance. He was by his own understanding, simply enforcing the law, and he had personal reasons to see the shipment landed. On the afternoon of December 16, several thousand people packed into the Old South Meeting House to hear whether the governor had relented. He had not. Samuel Adams reportedly told the crowd that they could do nothing more to save the country. That evening, somewhere between 30 and 150 men, some in Mohawk disguise that fooled nobody and was never meant to, went down to Griffin's Wharf. Over roughly 3 hours, they opened 342 chests and put the contents into the harbor. Estimates of the value run around 9,600 pounds sterling, which in today's money is comfortably over $1 million. And what strikes me most is how disciplined it was. Nothing else on those ships was touched. No crew member was harmed. Nobody pocketed any tea. And one man who tried to stuff some into his coat was stripped of it on the spot. A padlock was broken during the operation, and it was quietly replaced the next day. This was not a riot. A riot destroys indiscriminately. This was a group of men executing a targeted destruction of one specific commodity and taking visible care to damage nothing else. Because the entire point was to make a statement that could not be dismissed as criminality. They destroyed a bailout's collateral, and they cleaned up after themselves. News takes about 7 weeks to cross the Atlantic in winter. And when it reached London, there was already an American standing in the middle of a scandal that had nothing to do with tea. He had been summoned to appear at Whitehall on January 29. The cockpit was a room in the Palace of Whitehall named for the pit where the Tudors had staged cockfights on that site 2 centuries earlier. By 1774, it housed committee meetings of the Privy Council. On January 29, 1774, Benjamin Franklin walked into it. The matter before the council was, on its face, procedural. Massachusetts had petitioned the Crown to remove Governor Thomas Hutchinson from office, and the council had to consider the petition. But everyone in that room knew this was not really about the petition. It was about the letters. Sometime earlier, Franklin had come into possession of a bundle of private correspondence written years before by Hutchinson and his lieutenant governor to a government official in London. In them, Hutchinson had argued that there must be, in his phrase, an abridgment of what are called English liberties in the colonies. If the empire wished to maintain its authority there, Franklin sent them to Boston. He said afterward that his intention had been to reduce the anger, to show his countrymen that the harsh policies had been urged on London by Americans rather than invented by Parliament, and that reconciliation was therefore still possible. It was one of the worst misjudgments of his life. The letters were published. Boston exploded. And in London, Franklin was seen as a man who had stolen and leaked the private mail of a royal governor. The room was packed. 35 members of the Privy Council attended, an extraordinary turnout for a colonial petition, along with spectators who had come because word had gone around that something was going to happen. Lord North was there. Edmund Burke was there. Joseph Priestley, Franklin's friend, managed to get in and stood among the crowd. Franklin stood in a corner beside the fireplace, in a suit of spotted Manchester velvet. Then Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General, rose to speak for Hutchinson. Wedderburn was a Scottish lawyer with a reputation for savagery in argument and an ambition that would eventually carry him to Lord Chancellor. What he delivered was not a legal response to a petition. It was an hour of sustained personal destruction. He called Franklin a man of three letters, which was a Latin schoolboy joke meaning fur, fief. He said Franklin had forfeited any claim to be treated as a gentleman. He suggested that Franklin had orchestrated the whole colonial agitation for his own advancement, that he had stolen the correspondence, and that from this day he would be marked in the eyes of mankind. And the Privy Council laughed. These were the senior men of the British state, in the seat of government, laughing at a 68-year-old scientist while he was accused of theft in a proceeding where he had no counsel and no right of reply. Franklin did not respond. He stood absolutely still by that fireplace for the entire hour. By every account that survives, showing nothing at all, Priestley said afterward that he did not change his expression once when it ended. He walked out without a word. The petition was dismissed as groundless and vexatious. The following day he was stripped of his position as Deputy Postmaster General for North America, an office he had held for 2 decades and had genuinely loved, having spent years improving the colonial mail routes because he believed a functioning postal system knit the empire together. Here is what the men in that room did not grasp. They had just humiliated the last serious advocate for reconciliation in the English-speaking world. For 17 years, Franklin had lived in London, arguing in print and in private that America and Britain belonged together. He had proposed political union. He had told his countrymen to stay calm and trust that reasonable men would settle the dispute. As late as 1773, he was still writing letters urging patience. That version of Franklin left the cockpit and did not come back. He remained in England another 14 months, largely in silence, and sailed for Philadelphia in March of 1775. He arrived to find that fighting had already broken out at Lexington and Concord. Within a day of landing, he was elected to the Second Continental Congress. He was 70 years old, and he gave the rest of his life to the destruction of the empire he had spent his career trying to preserve. Now for the detail that I think is the most extraordinary in this entire story. On February 6, 1778 in Paris, Franklin signed the Treaty of Alliance with France. That treaty brought French money, the French fleet, and French troops into the war. Without it, there is a serious argument that the revolution fails. Witnesses noted what he wore that day. The spotted Manchester velvet, the same suit 4 years later, kept in a wardrobe across 2 countries and a war, and brought out for the one occasion where its meaning would be unmistakable to anyone who had been in that room. He never explained it. He never had to. The British Empire spent one morning humiliating the last friend it had in America. It paid for that morning with a continent. So let us put the whole machine back together in order, because none of these pieces means very much alone, and together they mean everything. The first crack, 1751 and 1764, the money supply is confiscated. Parliament stripped colonial paper of its status as legal tender, first in New England and then across all 13 colonies. It did this to settle a complaint from London merchants about being repaid in depreciated currency. It was a narrow fix to a narrow problem, and it took away the only instrument the colonies had ever used to survive a cash shortage. Nobody in Westminster considered it significant. It was never debated seriously and never repealed. The second crack, 1763. The creditor changes direction. Britain won the 7 Years' War and discovered that more than half of its annual revenue was going to service the debt it had won with. It could not tax its own landed class again without losing the ministry. So it turned toward the one asset that had never been squeezed and had no vote. Britain did not develop a new theory of empire in 1763. It developed a cash flow problem. The third crack, 1765, the trap closes. The Stamp Act demanded payment in sterling from colonies that had just been forbidden to create an alternative to sterling. 2 jaws, 11 months apart, and no evidence that anyone in Parliament ever noticed they were connected. The sum involved would not have covered 2 weeks of debt service. Both sides understood immediately that the money was not the point. The precedent was the fourth crack, 1772. The credit freezes. A London banker's bad bet took down 20 banking houses in a month, and the shock crossed the Atlantic through the Scottish tobacco houses, who called in every American account at once. Planters holding land, crops, and human beings on their ledgers could not raise cash, because there was no coin, because paper could not settle a debt, and because everyone was selling at the same moment. Virginia's courts eventually stopped functioning under the weight of debt suits. The fifth crack, 1773. The bill for the bailout arrives. The largest casualty of that crash was a corporation with its own army that also governed Bengal, and it was too entangled with British finance to be allowed to die. Parliament rescued it, but the rescue required a market for its unsold inventory, and rather than pay for that with British money, Parliament handed the company a preferential position in the American market and awarded the local franchises to a closed list that included the governor of Massachusetts' own sons. Now, none of these 5 decisions was a conspiracy. That is the part I want to insist on, because it is both true and more disturbing than the alternative. Every one of them was a reasonable measure taken by men trying to protect a balance sheet. Grenville was being fiscally responsible. The merchants were protecting the value of their receivables. Parliament was preventing a systemic collapse. Hutchinson was enforcing the law as written. Reasonable, defensible, and laid end to end across 11 years, sufficient to manufacture a nation. And this brings me to the thing that gets missed every July. The Declaration of Independence was not the moment of separation. By July of 1776, the shooting had been going on for 15 months. Bunker Hill had been fought, Boston had been besieged and evacuated, an American army was in the field under Washington, and Congress had already sent a diplomat to France. The Declaration was not a decision to leave. It was the paperwork filed after the departure, written largely to make foreign alliance legally possible. Because no European power can sign a treaty with a group of rebellious provinces, but any of them can sign one with a nation. The real separation had happened years earlier, and it happened quietly. It happened the moment a financial system in London decided that the colonies were an asset to be drawn on rather than a society to be governed with. Once that decision was made, everything downstream of it, the acts, the enforcement, the bailout, the humiliation in a committee room, followed with a kind of grinding logic that nobody in charge ever quite saw as a policy. July 4th is the death certificate. The patient had been gone for a while. Before I close this, I want to draw a hard line around what this video is and what it is not. There is a version of this story circulating online, and you have probably seen it. It goes something like this. The Bank of England, alarmed that the colonies were prospering with their own debt-free currency, forced Parliament to ban colonial script, and this alone caused the revolution. It usually comes attached to a quotation from Franklin, sometimes citing his autobiography, in which he supposedly says the colonies would gladly have paid the tea tax had England not taken away their money. That quotation is fake. It does not appear in his autobiography. It does not appear in his papers. It appears nowhere in the enormous surviving body of his writing, and it was traced to a 20th century source that produced it without attribution. If you see it, someone is repeating something they never checked. I bring it up because I do not need it, and neither does the truth. Everything in this video comes from the ordinary paper trail of an 18th century state. Acts of Parliament you can pull up in 10 seconds. The printed transcript of Franklin's examination before the House of Commons. Merchant ledgers, court records from Virginia, the company's own petitions to the Treasury, Priestley's account of the cockpit, written by a man who was standing in the room. This is not a hidden history. It is a boring one, filed under finance instead of under heroism, which is why it fell out of the story. So what does it leave us with? 3 questions. And I am going to leave them as questions. First, who decides what counts as money? And are the people who will live with that decision in the room when it is made? That was the actual grievance under all the others in 1764. Not the amount, the authority, a body 5 weeks sailing away, containing not one person accountable to a single American, altered the plumbing of an entire economy in an afternoon and then forgot it had done so. Second, when something is judged too large to be allowed to fail, who receives the bill? Parliament did not pay for the East India Company out of British tax revenue. It found a market that could be compelled to absorb the cost and had no representatives to object. That is not a story about tea. That is a structure. And structures outlive the centuries they are born in. Third, what happens to a society when private debt becomes hereditary? Jefferson called the planters a species of property annexed to certain mercantile houses. He was describing a class of men who owned enormous assets and controlled none of them, whose obligations arrived before they were born and outlasted their harvests. Some of the most eloquent language ever written about liberty was produced by men in that position, and I do not think that is a coincidence. One last thing, and it is almost too neat. In March of 1776, 4 months before the Declaration, a Scottish moral philosopher published a book in London arguing that the empire's colonies cost more to hold than they returned, that monopoly trading companies were a drag on the nations that chartered them, and that Britain should consider whether the whole arrangement was worth the expense. The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, the same year, in the same language, from within the same empire, almost nobody in government read it in time to matter, which is the pattern. The warning is never missing. It is just filed under economics, where nobody important is looking. So here is where this lands. A revolution rarely begins with a demand for liberty. It begins with a demand for payment. Britain did not lose America to an idea. It lost America to a balance sheet. And it was still reading that balance sheet when the first shots were fired at Lexington. If this changed how you see 1776, leave one thing in the comments. Just the year 1764. I want to see how many of you made it this far.